The morning Josephine Chandler first left a canteen on Dexter Keating's doorstep, she told herself it was nothing more than simple Christian charity, the kind any decent woman living on the edge of Harlan's Creek, Texas, would extend to a man who had clearly not drunk a proper cup of water in 3 days. It was the summer of 1883, and the sun over the hill country hit like a blacksmith's hammer, flat and merciless, baking the red clay earth until it cracked in long, wandering lines that reminded Josephine of old scars. She had been awake since before first light, the way she always was now, moving through her small house with the particular quietness of a woman who had grown accustomed to silence where there used to be sound. Her husband, Robert Chandler, had been dead 14 months. 14 months of learning how to sleep in the center of a bed that had always felt too narrow. 14 months of talking to her chickens, because they were the only ones who answered back without pity in their eyes. She was 29 years old, and she did not feel young, but she did not feel old either. She felt like something in between, like the last good light of an evening that hadn't yet decided whether it was going to hold or give way to dark. The man who had moved into the old Harcourt place at the far end of Juniper Lane had arrived 6 weeks ago with a single wagon, a bay horse named after something she hadn't caught, and the kind of silence around him that wasn't peaceful but wounded. She had seen him from her fence line once, just his back, broad shoulders curved inward the way a man carries grief when he doesn't want anyone to see it. She hadn't gone to introduce herself. Half the town had already decided he was trouble simply because he'd come from nowhere and said nothing. But Josephine had noticed things. She noticed that his well rope had gone slack, which meant either the pulley was broken or the well itself had gone dry. She noticed he hadn't been to the general store in 4 days, and in this heat, 4 days without proper water was a serious matter. She noticed the way his horse stood in the small pen beside the house with its head low, and that told her more than anything else about a man. A man who kept his horse in poor condition was a man in real trouble. But his horse was cared for. The animal was brushed and its water trough was full, which meant he had been hauling water for the horse from somewhere and going without himself. That was the thing that decided her. She filled her late husband's old cavalry canteen, the good one with the wool covering that kept things cool for hours, walked the 300 yards to his door in the early gray light before the heat rose, set it on the step, and walked back home without knocking. She told herself it was charity. She told herself it was what Robert would have done. She didn't examine it any further than that. Dexter Keating found the canteen at 6:30 in the morning when he came outside to check on Roper, his horse. He stood on the step in his boots and his undershirt, the canteen in his hand, and looked up and down the empty lane. The red dust hadn't settled from anyone's passage. Whoever had come very early and very quietly. He unscrewed the cap and smelled the water first, which was a habit left over from years of riding through country where water couldn't always be trusted, and what he smelled was clean and cold and faintly of tin. He drank half of it standing right there on the step, and the cold of it went down into him like something that had been missing for a long time. He was 33 years old, and he had come to Harlan's Creek, Texas, with the specific intention of disappearing from the life he'd been living. Not from shame, not from the law, but from the grinding weight of a world that had taken too much from him in too short a time. He had been a ranch foreman up in the Panhandle country for nearly 8 years, working for a cattle operation that had once been prosperous and had slowly gone under in the drought years of the late 70s. He had watched men he respected lose everything. He had lost his own savings when the operation folded, and then he had lost his younger brother to a fever the following winter. And then the woman he had thought he might marry had looked at him one dry morning and told him she needed a man with prospects, and she said it kindly, which was somehow worse than if she had said it with cruelty. He had come south looking for quiet and a place that didn't know his name, and Harlan's Creek had given him that. The town was small enough that strangers were notable, but not so small that a man couldn't keep to himself if he worked at it. He had enough money left to see him through several months while he figured out what came next, and the old Harcourt place was cheap, because everyone said it was haunted, which Dexter considered an advantage. The well had gone dry his second week there. He had been hauling water from the creek a quarter-mile east in the evenings, enough for Roper and just barely enough for himself, and the effort in the heat was starting to wear on him in ways he didn't want to admit. He stood on the step with the canteen and thought about the kind of person who got up before dawn to leave water for a stranger without waiting to be thanked. He thought about that for longer than he should have. The second morning, the canteen appeared again. Same step, same hour, same cold, clean water. This time there was a small cloth bundle tied to the handle with a bit of twine, and inside it was a square of cornbread still faintly warm from the oven. Dexter stood with the cornbread in his palm and felt something uncomfortable move through him that he recognized after a moment as the sensation of being taken care of, which he had not felt in a very long time, and which, he was alarmed to discover, made his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. He ate the cornbread. He drank the water. He told himself tomorrow he would be awake before dawn and he would see who it was. He overslept by 20 minutes and missed them again. The third morning he set his internal clock the way men who have spent years on cattle drives learn to do, waking before the alarm of sunrise, and he pulled on his boots in the dark and sat in the wooden chair beside his door and waited. The sky outside his one east-facing window went from black to deep blue to the color of iron filings, and then in that last stretch of gray before the sun crested the hills, he heard footsteps on the packed earth of the lane. Soft, deliberate footsteps, not heavy. A woman, he thought, or a slight man. He stayed very still. The footsteps came to his gate, paused, came through. He heard the step creak under a gentle weight. Then silence, then the footsteps again, retreating. He should have opened the door right then. He knew that later with the clarity of hindsight and felt a particular foolishness about it. But in that moment, sitting in the dark with his hand on the door handle, something stopped him. The same thing, perhaps, that had been stopping him from everything for the better part of 2 years. The instinct to stay still, to let the world pass at a slight distance, to not invite anything new that might later be taken away. He waited until the footsteps had faded completely before he opened the door. The canteen was there. Beside it was a small jar of something that turned out, when he held it to the window light, to be honey. He stood in his doorway with the honey jar and the canteen, and thought about a woman who left honey for a man she had never spoken to, and something in him that had been very quiet and very closed began, without his permission, to feel interested in the world again. Josephine told herself on the fourth morning that this was going to be the last time. It was not a sustainable thing, getting up before the roosters for a man who hadn't even had the courtesy to acknowledge the gesture. She was a practical woman. She had been practical all her life, practical in the way that daughters of hard-luck homesteaders have to be, practical in the way that young wives learn to be when their husbands work themselves to bone on land that barely gives enough back. She filled the canteen. She wrapped a piece of salt pork in a cloth. She went. The thing was, she had watched enough of the town's reaction to this man to know that nobody else was going to help him. Harlan's Creek had a particular smallness to it, the kind that bred suspicion of outsiders as a matter of habit. Old Clem Wheeler at the feed store had loudly declared that the man at the Harcourt place had the look of someone running from something, and once Clem Wheeler said a thing, it became the general opinion of half the town within 48 hours. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Prout, had suggested the newcomer might be a criminal. A man named Toll, who ran the barber shop, had said he'd heard from a man that the stranger had been involved in some business up north that didn't bear close examination. Josephine had listened to all of this at the dry goods store one afternoon while pretending great interest in a bolt of blue calico, and she had thought, privately, that people who talked that much about a man they had never spoken to were people who needed something to talk about more than they needed the truth. She didn't know if he was a good man. She didn't know anything about him except that he cared for his horse and he was going without water to do it. And those two facts together said something she trusted more than anything Clem Wheeler had ever said in his life. So she kept going. She was not thinking about his shoulders. She was absolutely not thinking about the way he had looked. That one time she'd seen him clearly near the fence line, with his dark hair and the straight set of his jaw, and the particular quality of stillness about him that was different from the stillness of ordinary quiet men. She was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about Christian charity. The town, for its part, had plenty of opinions about Josephine Chandler that she was mostly too dignified to acknowledge. She knew people talked. In a town of 400 and some souls, a widow of 29 with her own small property and no children was a subject of endless quiet speculation. Some thought she ought to have remarried already. Some thought she was too particular. The widower Arnott, who ran the lumber yard, had called on her twice and been received politely and sent away each time, and after the second occasion he had gone around telling people that Josephine Chandler thought herself above ordinary men, which was not true. She didn't think herself above anyone. She simply did not want to marry a man whose most prominent quality was that he was available and in possession of a lumber yard. Robert had been a good man. Not a complicated man, not a passionate man in the particular ways that novels described passion, but steady and decent and genuinely kind, and she had loved him in the way you love a good piece of ground. He had died of a chest sickness that came on fast and went faster, and she had sat beside him through 3 nights and held his hand and said his name, and then she had buried him on the rise behind their property under a post oak tree, and she had gone on. Going on was something Josephine Chandler was very good at. What she was less good at, she was beginning to realize on the 5th morning as she walked through the pre-dawn dark with the canteen in her hand, was explaining to herself why the simple act of leaving water on a stranger's doorstep had become the thing she looked forward to most about her days. The 5th morning she was later than usual. She had been delayed by one of her hens getting loose in the night and requiring finding in the dark, which involved a great deal of searching and one significant collision with her water barrel that left a bruise on her hip. By the time she reached Juniper Lane, the sky was already beginning to lighten from black to deep blue, and she was aware that she was cutting the margin thinner than she liked. She came through the gate, climbed the single step, set the canteen down beside a small stone she had taken to using as a sort of marker, straightened up, and came face to face with the door opening. She was already 2 steps back toward the gate by the time she registered what had happened, and she stopped with her hand on the fence post and looked back, her heart beating with a speed that she found both undignified and difficult to explain. The door had not, in fact, opened all the way. It had moved, a small movement, a breath of space between door and frame, and then stopped. She stood at the gate and looked at that thin line of shadow where the door stood ajar and felt, with absolutely certainty, that he was standing right on the other side of it. She should say something. She was aware that she should say something. The social architecture of the situation practically demanded it. But the words that came to mind all felt wrong, either too formal or too familiar, and the moment stretched past the point where anything could be said naturally. And so she did the only sensible thing available to her, which was to turn around and walk home at a pace that she hoped projected confidence rather than flight. Her heart didn't slow down for a full hour. Dexter stood with his hand on the door handle and listened to her footsteps retreat and felt like the most significant kind of fool there was. He had been ready. He had been awake and ready and seated by the door, and then when the moment came he had opened it to exactly the width of a hesitation and no further. He had seen her hand on the fence post. Just that, her hand and the edge of a dark sleeve and the pale curve of a wrist, and then she had gone. He pushed the door fully open and stood in the frame and looked at the empty lane in the early light and said, quietly and without particular drama, "What is the matter with you, Dexter?" Roper, from his pen, flicked an ear in what felt like agreement. He picked up the canteen. Inside, tied around the handle with the same kind of twine as always, there was a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was clean and small and even, the handwriting of someone who had been well taught and who took care. It said, "The creek is a quarter-mile east through the post oaks. There is a good spring on the north bank that runs clear all year. You are welcome to use it. No name, no signature, just the information, practical and plain." He folded the note very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and stood in his doorway and looked east toward the post oaks until the sun came up properly and turned the world from gray to gold. He found the spring the next morning. It was exactly where she had said it would be, tucked into a north-facing crook of the bank, where the roots of an ancient cottonwood had made a natural basin in the clay. The water came up cold and clear from somewhere deep in the limestone below, and it tasted the way water was supposed to taste, of stone and dark earth and something almost sweet. He filled 2 large pots and a bucket for Roper and carried them back, and then he came back to the spring and sat on the bank for a while, just sitting, which was not something he had allowed himself in a long time. The post oaks filtered the morning light into moving pieces. A mockingbird was working through its entire catalog in the trees upstream. The creek slid past amber and shallow over smooth stones. He thought about the note. He thought about the handwriting. He thought about a person who knew where the springs were, who had walked this ground enough times to know which one ran year-round, who had taken the trouble to write it down and tie it to a canteen handle for a stranger who hadn't even shown her the basic courtesy of a face. He needed to fix the well, but more immediately, he needed to knock on that door. He spent 2 more weeks not doing it. The 6th morning of the 2nd week since the note, a Saturday in July when the heat was enough to make the air shimmer over the lane, Josephine set the canteen on the step as she always did and turned to go and heard the door open behind her. She stopped. She heard him come onto the step. She heard the boards take his weight. She heard him take a breath. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and had a particular quality of roughness to it that sounded not harsh but like something rarely used, like an instrument that had been put away for too long. Josephine turned around very slowly, taking that moment to compose her face into something that she hoped communicated pleasant neighborly surprise, rather than the fact that her hands were cold despite the heat, and her mouth had gone dry in a way that made the canteen of water suddenly feel personally ironic. He was taller than she had registered from across the property line. He was standing in the doorway, and the morning light was coming over her shoulder and hitting him fully, and she saw the dark hair, longer than fashionable, and the jaw she had noticed before, and brown eyes that were direct in a way that made her feel both seen and slightly off balance, and a face that carried the particular weathering of a man who had spent years in the open, with the lines of it not unkind but serious and a little worn. He was looking at her like he wasn't quite sure she was real. She thought she probably looked the same way. "Good morning," she said. Her voice came out steady, which she considered a significant personal triumph. He came down the step. He stood at proper distance, his hands loose at his sides, and he said, "I owe you more thanks than I know how to give, ma'am. I should have said so a long time ago." "You were under no obligation," she said. "Maybe not," he said. "But it was a good thing you did, a necessary thing. I don't want to be the kind of man that lets that go unacknowledged." She looked at him. He looked at her. The mockingbird that seemed to live in the post oaks was calling from somewhere in the middle distance, and from down the lane a rooster at the Prentice farm was making its opinions known about the hour. "I'm Josephine Chandler," she said. "My property is the one with the gray fence and the garden." "Dexter Keating," he said. He did not offer a hand, which she noticed, and she thought he noticed her noticing, because something shifted in his expression. He raised his right hand instead in a small half gesture that wasn't quite a tip of a hat because he wasn't wearing one, and looked, because of it, briefly and charmingly uncertain. "Mr. Keating," she said. "Mrs. Chandler," he said. They stood in the lane in the early morning heat, and Josephine thought, clearly and with some alarm, that she could stand here for considerably longer than was sensible and not find it objectionable. "I hear your well went dry," she said instead. "2 weeks in," he confirmed. "I've been meaning to redig it, but I haven't had the tools." "My late husband's tools are in the shed," she said. "You're welcome to borrow them. The well digger is there and the iron casing." She watched something careful move across his face at the words late husband, not pity. Something more like recognition, the brief acknowledgement of one person who understands the weight of certain words to another. "I'd be grateful," he said. "I'd pay for the use of them." "You won't," she said. "Neighbors don't pay each other for tools in this county. It's not done." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the suggestion of one, the ghost of the shape of a smile, and it changed his whole face in a way that Josephine registered and then firmly filed away somewhere she would not be examining until she was alone. "Then I'm grateful for the neighborly courtesy," he said. "I'll have them at the fence line before 9, she said. "Mrs. Chandler," he said as she turned to go. She looked back. "Would you," he said, and then stopped. He looked at the lane and then at her again. "Would you like to take a cup of coffee? I have coffee. I realize I've been taking your hospitality for 6 weeks without offering any return." The coffee, she thought, was almost certainly terrible. Men living alone in heat country were not known for their coffee. But she looked at him standing in his doorway in the early morning light, asking her in the particular careful way of a man who was not accustomed to asking for things, and she said, "Thank you, I'd like that." The coffee was, as she had suspected, not good. He had made it camp-style, boiled in a pot, strong enough to stand a spoon up in, and he offered it to her in a tin mug at his small kitchen table with the expression of a man who suspected it might not meet standards. She drank it without comment, and thought that there was something unexpectedly comfortable about sitting in his kitchen, which was spare and clean in the way of a man who had no clutter because he had no excess. There was a table and 2 chairs and a shelf of provisions, and a cast-iron stove and one window looking east toward the post oaks. On the shelf beside the door there were 3 books, which she noted with interest because they were an unusual thing to find in a working man's home in 1883. "You read," she said. He looked at the shelf. "When I can," he said. "It's a habit I got from my mother." "What are they?" He got up and brought them to her without ceremony. One was a battered copy of Tennyson. One was a surveying manual, practical and annotated in pencil. One was a volume she didn't recognize, a natural history of the Texas hill country. "The surveying manual," she said. "I used to work range survey in my early days," he said, sitting back down, "before cattle." "You were a ranch hand, foreman," he said, "for 8 years up in the Panhandle country." She turned the natural history volume over in her hands. "And before that?" He looked at her. "Before that I was 18 and didn't know what I was," he said. "What about you? What about me?" "You know the springs," he said. "You know which ones run all year. You know the land around here." "I grew up here," she said. "Not in this house. My father's place was 10 miles south out past the Medina. I've known this particular stretch of creek since I was a girl." "How long have you been in the Chandler house?" 7 years, she said. "My husband built it the year we were married." There was the careful pause again, the careful acknowledgement. "He died last year," she said, because she found she didn't want him to have to navigate around it. "Chest fever, it was fast." "I'm sorry," he said. Not the elaborate sorry of people who didn't know what else to say, but the plain sorry of someone who understood that there was no other word for it, and that the word was real. "Thank you," she said. They drank the terrible coffee. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor in a slow diagonal. A fly moved in long circles near the ceiling. Outside, Roper stamped once in his pen, a sound of comfortable complaint. "Mr. Keating," she said, "the question that is on every tongue in Harlan's Creek, and that I will ask you plainly so that you don't have to wonder whether I'm wondering." He looked at her with those direct brown eyes. Where did you come from and what brought you here?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive quiet, considering quiet. "I came from Amarillo," he said. "Before that from Clayton County up near the New Mexico border. The operation I foremaned went under 2 years ago. I spent a year after that doing piecework, riding fence for other outfits, trying to find a purchase on something. I came south because I needed," he paused, "a quieter kind of ground." "Were you running from something?" "No," he said. "I was running towards something, I just didn't know what it was yet." She considered that. "That's an honest answer," she said. "You asked an honest question," he said. She stood up and set the tin mug on his table. "The tools will be at the fence line before 9, she said. "If you need a hand with the re-dig, my neighbor's boy, young Marcus Hale, is 16 and strong and works for a fair day's wage." "I can manage it," he said. "I'm sure you can," she said. "But the water table here is deceptive. There's a limestone shelf at 12 feet that'll break your back if you're not going around it at the right angle. Marcus has watched my well redug twice and he knows the technique." He looked at her for a moment. "You know a great deal about wells," he said. "I know a great deal about a great many things," she said pleasantly, "that men tend to assume women don't know." The ghost of the smile appeared again. This time it got closer to being a real one. "I'll send for Marcus Hale," he said. "The well took 3 days." Marcus Hale, who was a good-natured boy with his father's big frame and his mother's practical intelligence, arrived the first morning with a pickaxe and the kind of cheerful willingness that made hard work feel less grim. Dexter worked alongside him without complaint, and Josephine, who had no particular reason to be checking the fence line on the east side of her property 3 times in one afternoon, noted that the man worked hard and fair, did not bark at the boy or take shortcuts, and shared his water without being asked. On the afternoon of the second day, she brought a pot of beans and salt pork to the worksite because she had made too much, which was entirely true and also somewhat convenient. She set it on the back step of the Harcourt house with a pot of cornbread and went home without lingering, and she heard Marcus Hale say from inside the work hole, "Mr. Keating, I think your neighbor likes you," and she walked faster. She was smiling by the time she reached her own gate. By the end of the 3rd day the well was done, properly dug below the limestone shelf, cased in iron and bricked at the top. Dexter came to return the tools himself, carrying them over his shoulder in the early evening when the light had gone golden and long, and Josephine was in her garden because the tomatoes needed tying up, and so they were both there and it would have been rude to pretend otherwise. "Done?" she asked. "Done," he said. "Good water at 19 feet, clean and cold." "Good," she said. He set the tools down against the fence and stood with his hands in his pockets, and she recognized the posture of a man who wants to say something and is working himself up to it. She waited. "I'd like," he said, "to do something in return, for the tools, for the weeks of water, for telling me about Marcus." "For the beans." He said the last word with a slight shift in his expression that acknowledged he knew she'd known about the beans. "Is there anything on your property that needs doing?" She looked at him. She looked at her property, which needed, if she was honest, a great many things, because 14 months of widowhood on a working farm with no husband and hired hands she could only occasionally afford had left certain things in a state of honest neglect. "The roof of the chicken house has a gap," she said. "I've been meaning to get to it, but I haven't." "I can do that," he said. "The porch step is soft," she said. "That too." "There are a dozen other things," she said, "but those 2 would be the most pressing." "I'll come tomorrow morning," he said, "if that's all right." "That's all right," she said. He picked up the tools and turned to go and then looked back at her over his shoulder. "Mrs. Chandler, Mr. Keating. You make better cornbread than anyone I've eaten in the better part of 10 years, he said. "That's not flattery, that's a plain statement of fact." She felt the warmth of it all the way to the backs of her ears, and she was very grateful that the late evening light was not strong enough to show color in a woman's face. "Get some sleep, Mr. Keating," she said. "The chicken house roof won't fix itself." His laugh was low and brief and real, and she carried the sound of it inside with her like something worth keeping. He came in the morning as promised, and he fixed the chicken house roof with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, and he replaced the soft porch step with new timber she had in the shed, and he did it all without making it feel like a debt being settled or charity being extended, just two neighbors in the natural order of things, which was exactly right. She brought him coffee mid-morning. Her own coffee, which was considerably better than his, because she had learned the making of it from a woman named Carla Reyes who had worked for her mother and who had opinions about coffee so strong they amounted to philosophy. He drank it and said nothing for a moment and then said, "How do you do that?" "Carla Reyes," she said. "Who is Carla Reyes?" "She was the most competent woman I have ever known in my life," said Josephine. "She could cook, she could ride, she could deliver a calf and argue scripture and make coffee that would make a man reconsider his entire relationship with the morning. She went back to San Antonio when my mother died. I have thought about her coffee regularly for 12 years. He was watching her talk, not in a way that made her feel examined, but in a way that made her feel listened to, which was a different thing entirely and rarer. "Tell me about your mother," he said. It was not a question she had been asked often. Most people who wanted to make conversation asked about Robert or about the farm or about the weather or about some piece of local business. Nobody asked about her mother. She told him. She told him about a woman named Ellen Marsh, who had come to Texas from Ohio at 19 years old because her father had a land grant and a dream, and who had found herself on raw ground with inadequate supplies and a husband whose optimism outran his practical abilities, and who had made something out of it anyway by force of will and intelligence and a fundamental refusal to be defeated by circumstance. She told him about the garden her mother had kept, the first real garden in that part of the county, with vegetables and herbs and flowers, because her mother had maintained firmly that flowers were not a luxury but a necessity for the soul. She told him about reading aloud in the evenings, the three of them, her father and her mother and Josephine herself, taking turns with whatever books they had. He listened to all of it without interrupting. "She sounds extraordinary," he said. "She was," said Josephine. "She died when I was 18, fever. And then you married Robert Chandler. 2 years later," she said, 20 years old. "He came to my father's farm to buy horses and he stayed for dinner and then he stayed through the winter and in the spring we got married." "Did you love him?" The directness of the question startled her. People didn't ask that. It was not something people asked a widow. She looked at him, and he was watching her with a directness that was somehow not intrusive but honest, the same honest directness with which he had answered her own questions that first morning in his kitchen. "Yes," she said. "Not the way the novels describe it, but yes. He was a good man, reliable, kind. He worked himself to bone for this place. He was the kind of man who never once raised his voice or his hand, and I knew that was rare and I was grateful for it every day." He nodded slowly. "That's love," he said. "The novel kind is for novels." She looked at him with interest. "Is that experience speaking?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There was a woman up in the Panhandle. Her name was Clara. I thought for a while that she was at the end of looking. And then the operation went under and I had nothing left to show for 8 years of work and she made a different choice and I couldn't find it in myself to blame her for it. But it took a good while to stop feeling like I'd been hollowed out." Josephine was quiet. She thought about the curve of those shoulders she had seen from the fence line, the inwardness of them, the carried weight. "When did you stop feeling that way?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Fairly recently," he said. "The mockingbird was calling again from the post oaks. The chickens were moving in their house, making the particular soft sounds of chickens in the afternoon heat. The sky was very blue and very large, the way the Texas sky always was in summer, the kind of sky that made everything under it feel both very small and very alive. "You should stay for supper," she said. "I have a chicken that is past its laying days and it seems the right evening for it." "I don't want to impose," he said. "You're not imposing," she said. "You fixed my roof and my step and you listened to me talk about my mother for a quarter hour. You've earned a meal." He looked at her for a moment with those brown eyes and then said simply, "Thank you. Supper was good." She cooked the chicken low and long with rosemary from her garden and dried peppers from last year's harvest. And she made biscuits and a pot of coffee, and set the table in a way that felt natural and not performative, because she had decided very early in her adult life that the way you set a table was the way you treated people, and she intended to treat people well regardless of the circumstances. He was good at table conversation in the way of a man who had spent years in bunkhouses and at campfires, which meant he had enough stories and the sense to keep them moving and the self-awareness to know when to stop and listen. He told her about the surveying work he'd done in his early 20s, threading through broken country that no map had gotten around to yet, following dry creek beds and coyote paths, and the instincts of a mule named Bartholomew who had a better sense of direction than any instrument. She laughed at Bartholomew. He looked at her when she laughed and looked away again, and she saw the looking and the looking away. After supper they sat on the porch because the house was warm and the evening air had softened to something almost comfortable. The bats were coming out over the creek, moving in quick angles against the darkening sky. A whippoorwill was calling from the mesquite thicket south of the property. "This is good land," he said. "It is," she said. "What will you do with it?" She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously and he deserved a serious answer. "I have the garden and the chickens. I take in laundry for a few households in town to make up the difference. In good years I grow enough corn to sell what I don't need. The house is paid for and the land is mine clear." She paused. "What will you do with the Harcourt place?" "I've been thinking," he said, "about whether there's a well-digging operation to be had in this county. The water table's deep and quirky and half the new homesteads coming in are going dry. A man who knows what he's doing could make a fair living at it." "That's a good thought," she said. "There are 3 new claims filed just south of town in the last year alone, all of them struggling with water." "You pay attention to things," he said. "I do," she said. "People generally don't expect it from women, which makes it easier." He smiled. The full smile this time, not the ghost of it. It was a good smile. It took the seriousness out of his face and replaced it with something younger and warmer, and Josephine thought that it was the kind of smile that a man who had been sad for a long time produced when he forgot for a moment to be sad, and it was worth considerable effort to produce. She looked at the bats and not at him. "Mr. Keating," she said. "Dexter," he said, "please." She considered the informality for a moment. They were sitting on her porch in the dark, eating her food and talking about their lives, and she supposed formality had run its natural course somewhere around the story of Bartholomew the mule. "Dexter," she said, "I have to tell you something." He was very still. "The town talks about you," she said. "I expect you know that. Clem Wheeler has you down as a criminal, and Mrs. Prout has you as generally dangerous, and Arnott the widower is telling people you're driving down property values simply by your existence." He was quiet. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that I don't hold any of that. I never did. And if you're in town and someone says something to your face, you can tell them Josephine Chandler speaks well of you, and that will carry some weight because I've lived here my whole life and I have an unremarkable reputation." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, in a voice that was even lower than usual, "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Take care of people you don't know." She thought about it honestly. "Because somebody should," she said. "And because I believe in the evidence of small things. You keep your horse well, you fix things properly, not quickly. You borrow tools and return them clean. Those are not the actions of a bad man." She paused. "Also, you listen to me talk about my mother." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to it, not a happy sound, something more complicated. Something like a man who has been alone for a long time and is finding the unfamiliarity of being known in small ways almost more than he knows what to do with. "Josephine," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it was not done casually or with presumption. It was done the way you say something out loud that you have been thinking quietly for a while and have finally decided to trust. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for the canteens, for the spring, for the tools, for the beans and the cornbread and the chicken, for this." He looked at the darkening sky and the bats. "For this evening." "You're welcome," she said. "Dexter." They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out, and when he finally stood to go, he stood at the porch steps in the dark and put on his hat, which he had brought with him this time, and looked at her with those direct brown eyes and said, "May I call on you, properly, this Sunday?" Josephine Chandler had been proposed to informally twice since Robert's death, had been subject of considerable matchmaking from well-meaning neighbors, and had sat through 2 formal calls from Arnott the widower, with the patience of a woman who understood social obligation, even when it was unpleasant. None of those occasions had made her heart beat the way it was beating right now. "Sunday," she said. Yes. Sunday was 3 days away, and those 3 days were, in Josephine's private assessment, the longest of the recent year. She went about her work with the particular discipline of a practical woman who refuses to be made foolish by her own feelings, and she succeeded reasonably well at the discipline, with occasional lapses that involved standing in the garden thinking about a particular smile when she was supposed to be thinking about the tomatoes. She said nothing to anyone. This was partly because there was no one in particular to tell, and partly because she was aware that the moment any word of this reached Clem Wheeler or Mrs. Prout, there would be a particular kind of social difficulty that she preferred to postpone until there was something definitive to announce. She wore her second-best dress on Sunday, not her best, because her best was for church, and it would be noticeable and noted. Her second best was a deep green cotton with pearl buttons that Robert had always said suited her, and she put her hair up properly, and wore her mother's small silver earrings, and told herself she was not doing any of this in a particular anticipation, because she was a sensible woman of 29 and not a girl of 17. He came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with his hat in his hand, and his hair combed back and wearing a clean white shirt that was not new but had been carefully ironed, which told her things about him that were all favorable. He had brought her a jar of wild honey from the creek bank, which was both a practical gift and a reference to the honey he had not been able to acknowledge for 6 weeks, and she appreciated the particular wit of it. They sat on the porch and talked through the whole afternoon, through the long sliding of the Sunday light from afternoon gold to evening copper, and what they talked about was everything: his years on the range and what they had taught him, her father's farm and the particular quality of grief that comes not from one event but from the slow accumulation of losses over years, the books they had read, the places they had been, the things they believed about God and land and the nature of hard work and what it was for. He told her about his brother. His name had been Nathaniel, and he had been the lighter of the 2 of them, the one who laughed easily and played fiddle and could charm a room into good humor in 20 minutes. He had died of typhoid in the winter of '81 at the age of 26, and Dexter described it without flinching, in the plain way of someone who has processed grief long enough to talk about it without being dismantled by it, but she heard the weight under the plainness. "He sounds like someone the world needed more of," she said. "He was," Dexter said. "He was the best of us." She thought about that, about being the one who stays when the better ones go. "I don't think it works like that," she said. He looked at her. "I think you're both the better one and the one who stayed," she said. "That's not a failure, that's just the way it lands sometimes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Josephine," he said, with that same quality of out-loud thought. "Yes," she said. "I haven't talked to anyone like this," he said, "in a very long time." "Neither have I," she said honestly. They were quiet together after that, the easy quiet of 2 people who have found that silence in company is a different thing entirely from silence alone, and the evening came down around them pink and warm, and Josephine thought that she could grow very used to this particular shape of an evening. When he stood to go, he held his hat in both hands and said, "May I call again next Sunday?" "You may," she said. "And in between," he said carefully, "if I happen to walk in the direction of your fence line on a weekday evening, She felt the smile come before she could manage it. "I am generally in the garden in the evenings," she said, "between 5 and 7. "Is that right?" he said. "That is exactly right," she said. He put his hat on and walked down the lane in the last of the light, and she watched him go from the porch, and did not pretend to herself that she was watching for any reason other than the one that was becoming increasingly clear to her, which was that somewhere in the space of 6 weeks and one Sunday afternoon, she had gone from a widow managing her loneliness with reasonable success to a woman in the early stages of something she was not yet calling by its name, but that had the particular warm weight of it. The weekday evenings became their own institution. He would come to the fence line at 5:30, sometimes with a small thing, a cutting of wild sage, a handful of plums from the tree that had gone wild behind the Harcourt house, once a small piece of carved wood that turned out to be a rough rendering of a mockingbird, done with a pocket knife in an idle hour. She would be in the garden and they would talk over the fence, or she would open the gate and they would walk the property line or sit on the step of the chicken house and watch the sunset come in over the hills. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. It was a small town in 1883, and there were not that many things to notice. Mrs. Prout mentioned it at the dry goods store with the carefully neutral voice of a woman who has opinions she is performing the courtesy of not stating. Clem Wheeler told 2 people that he had always said it would end in something regrettable. Arnott the widower stopped speaking to Josephine at church, which she found she minded very little. Her closest neighbor, a woman named Bess Hale, Marcus's mother, came over on a Wednesday afternoon with a preserving pot she had borrowed 6 months ago and an expression of barely restrained curiosity. "He's over there every evening," Bess said, setting the pot on the kitchen table and not immediately leaving. "Yes," said Josephine. "People are talking," said Bess. "People always talk," said Josephine. "Joe," said Bess, who had known her since they were girls, "are you going to tell me anything at all about this man?" Josephine poured coffee for them both and sat down at the table. She considered what she wanted to say and how much of it she wanted to say, and then she said, "He is a good man, Bess. A genuinely good man, and I haven't said that about many people in recent memory. He is honest and he works hard and he listens and he makes me feel like myself when I'm with him, the full version of myself, not the reduced version I've been living in since Robert died." Bess looked at her friend for a moment. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Joe, don't," said Josephine. "I'm not saying anything. You have a look on your face that is saying everything." Bess covered her smile with her coffee cup. "He's handsome," she said. "That is irrelevant." "Of course it is." "Bess." "I think it's wonderful," Bess said, and set down her cup and put her hand over Josephine's hand on the table, and her voice was sincere and warm, and the look in her eyes was the look of a woman who has known someone through hard times and is glad to see the weather change. "I think it's genuinely wonderful." Josephine looked down at the table. "I don't know yet what it is," she said quietly. "Yes, you do," said Bess. Josephine looked up at her. Bess smiled. "You know exactly what it is," she said. "You've known for a while, you're just being careful because you're you." Josephine was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't said anything," she said. "Joe," said Bess, "look at the man, he leaves you carved birds." Josephine thought about the carved mockingbird sitting on her windowsill looking out toward the post oaks. "He's being careful too," said Bess. "Too careful, people. It'll take a bit." It took 3 more weeks. In those 3 weeks he came to her fence every evening and they talked and walked and sat. And the Sunday afternoon calls continued and expanded. And she began to know him the way you know a place when you walk it in all weathers, the texture and the depth and the particular quality of it in different lights. She knew that he took his coffee without sugar, and that he had a slight preference for solitude that was not antisocial but necessary, the way solitude is necessary for people whose interior lives are busy. She knew that he had a direct and slightly unexpected sense of humor that arrived quietly, without announcement, which made it funnier. She knew that he had a deep respect for land and water that came from years of watching both be misused. She knew that he was setting up the well-digging operation slowly and methodically, that he had 2 clients already in the new homestead country south of town, and that Marcus Hale was going to work for him in the summers. She knew that when something troubled him, he looked at the middle distance and went still, not the closed stillness of someone hiding but the open stillness of someone genuinely thinking, and she had learned to give that stillness its room. She knew that he looked at her. Not in the way of men who look at women as though cataloging their attributes, but in the way of someone for whom the specific gravity of a particular person has become necessary, and he is still figuring out what to do about it. The evening it happened was an ordinary Tuesday, the last week of August. The heat had broken a little with a thunderstorm in the afternoon, and the evening air had the particular washed clarity of post-rain Texas, everything smelling of wet cedar and clean earth, the sky an extraordinary deep blue with the last of the storm clouds going gold at their edges. They were sitting on her porch step. Not because they had planned to sit there. They had been walking the fence line, and then her fence needed a closer look at one post that had gone soft, and he had examined it with the professional eye of a man who has done this kind of work all his life, and then he had gotten a new post from her shed and set it in 30 minutes in the post-rain earth. And then they were both dirty and a little tired, and they sat on the porch step and watched the clouds. He was sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She was very aware of the warmth of him. "Josephine," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the clouds. "I need to say something to you." "Go ahead," she said. He turned to look at her. He was close, and in the blue-gold evening light he looked exactly like himself, earnest and a little uncertain and fully present. "I came to this county," he said, "looking for quiet and some room to figure out what came next. I had been," he paused, emptied out. "I felt like a piece of country after a hard drought, the kind where nothing wants to grow back for a while." She was very still. "And then there was water on my step every morning," he said. "And then there was a note in the handwriting of someone who clearly paid attention to things. And then there was coffee on a hot morning and a woman who asked me direct questions and listened to the answers." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know if I have a right to say this yet. I don't know if the ground is right for it, but I know that when I try to think about the next year and what it looks like, I cannot make myself picture it without you in it, and I thought you ought to know that." Josephine's throat was tight in a way that was not unpleasant. "Dexter," she said. "Yes." "The next year," she said, "and the one after it." He looked at her. "I don't picture the next year without you in it either," she said. "I've stopped trying." The space between them on the porch step was not large, and he crossed it deliberately and without haste, and he took her hand in both of his, rough and careful and warm, and he said, "Tell me what you want." "I want," she said, and found that it came out easier than she expected. "I want to stop being careful. I want to stop managing things at a safe distance. I want you to stop coming to the fence line every evening and start coming to the door." He looked at her hand in his and then at her face. "I want to know you for a very long time," she said. "I want to see what the Harcourt place looks like when someone has lived in it with intention. I want to hear what you think about things and argue with you when I disagree and feed you coffee in the morning and watch you work." She paused. "I want to be happy again. I had forgotten what that felt like, and then you sat at my kitchen table and drank terrible coffee and told me about a mule named Bartholomew, and I remembered." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, briefly and gently, and looked up at her over it. "Josephine Chandler," he said, "I am going to ask you something properly, and when I do I want it to be done right, at a proper time with proper circumstance. But I need you to know, right now, that I intend to ask." Her eyes were bright in a way she was not going to apologize for. "I'll be waiting," she said. The proper question came on a September Sunday, 3 weeks later, in the shade of the post oak tree on the rise behind her property where Robert was buried, because Dexter had asked her, carefully and with complete sincerity, whether she felt it was right to do it there, and she had loved him for asking. They had walked up in the morning with the grass cool and wet and the hills going gold-green under the early light, and she had spoken to Robert Stone in the quiet way she always did, the matter-of-fact communication of a practical woman with the dead, and Dexter had stood a few feet back with his hat in his hands, and his eyes down in a respect that was genuine and not performed. And then they had walked a little further up the hill to where the post oak spread out over a limestone outcropping, and the view went for 20 miles in 3 directions, and the sky was the enormous September blue, and Dexter Keating got down on one knee in the grass and looked up at her. "Josephine," he said, "I am 33 years old and I have worked hard for everything I have and lost most of it and come to terms with what remains. What remains is not much in the way of possessions, but it includes a commitment to honest work and a desire to build something that lasts, and a certainty that has been growing in me since the morning I found water on my doorstep, that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met in my life." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" She had known it was coming. She had been waiting for it. She had made up her mind about it a good while ago. She still had to breathe through the moment twice before she could speak. "Yes," she said. "Dexter." "Yes." He stood up, and she took both his hands and they stood on the hill in the September light, and the feeling that moved through her was not the giddy, uncertain feeling of a young girl at her first love. It was something deeper and steadier and more serious than that. The feeling of a woman who has lost enough to know what keeping something means, choosing again with full knowledge of what choosing costs and what it gives. He put his hands on her face and kissed her on that hilltop, with the whole hill country spread out below them and the post oak moving in the early wind above them, and the kiss was careful and then not careful, and it tasted of coffee and the particular sweetness of something that has been long coming. When they came apart, she kept her hands flat against his chest and looked up at him and said, "The Chandler house or the Harcourt place?" He blinked. "What?" "We should talk about the practical matters immediately," she said, "or I'll spend the rest of the day in an undignified state." He laughed. The full laugh, not the low, brief sound, but the real thing, open and warm and surprised, and it was the best thing she had heard in years. "Practical matters," he said. "All right. The Chandler house is larger," she said, "and it has the garden and the chicken house and Robert's tools. The Harcourt place has the well I didn't pay for and a natural history of the Texas hill country and is haunted according to general opinion. I was going to suggest we live in the Chandler house," he said. "If that's all right." "It's all right," she said. "What will you do with the Harcourt place?" "Rent it," he said. "There are families coming into the county. The well-digging work is building. In a year or 2 I think we can afford to improve it and charge proper rent." "We," she said. "We," he said, and the word was deliberate and warm and meant exactly what it sounded like. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and felt the solidness of him, the real physical fact of a person who was present and there and not going anywhere. "We should go tell Bess Hale," she said. "Bess Hale will have us for the rest of the day," he said. "That's true," she said. "But she will also be incandescent with happiness, and she deserves to be incandescent." He tucked her hand into his arm and they walked down the hill in the morning light, and the world below them was the ordinary beautiful world it had always been, the creek glinting through the post oaks and the town visible in its scatter of wood and tin a mile north and the hills rolling south toward the Medina, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Bess Hale was, indeed, incandescent. She made them sit down and stay for a meal they had not planned on, and she called Marcus in from the yard to hear the news, and Marcus shook Dexter's hand with the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old who had decided 3 weeks into the well-digging that this was the kind of man he wanted to be around. And then Bess quietly went to the back room and came back with a bottle of good whiskey that she had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion, and none of them spoke of it because a good occasion deserved its good whiskey. Reverend Prout, to his credit and somewhat contrary to his wife's expectations, married them 6 weeks later in the first week of October, in the small white church on Main Street, with the afternoon light coming through the plain windows, and making long squares of gold on the wooden floor. Bess Hale was Josephine's witness. Marcus Hale, who was half a foot taller than the occasion seemed to require, stood up for Dexter with a dignity beyond his years. The Prentice family came, and the Garza family from south of town, and old widow Holloway, who had brought Josephine a pie 3 times in the first month of her first widowhood, and who wept with happiness throughout the ceremony. Clem Wheeler did not come. Mrs. Prout sat in the back pew and kept her expression carefully composed. Arnott the widower was not present. None of this mattered to Josephine, who walked down the aisle of the church in her best dress, the one she had been saving, with her mother's earrings and a small bunch of late-season flowers from her own garden, and looked at Dexter Keating waiting at the front of the church in his best clothes with his hat in his hands and that look on his face, the particular look of a man who cannot quite believe his luck, and thought that she had never in her life felt so certain about anything. "I do," she said, when the Reverend asked her, and meant it in every direction. The first year of their marriage was the year Dexter's well-digging operation found its feet. He had 4 clients by Christmas, and by the following spring there were 8, and he had hired Marcus full-time for the summer season and taken on a second hand, a quiet Mexican man named Pio Garza, who was the brother of their neighbor, and who knew the hill country water table the way other men knew the backs of their hands. Josephine kept her garden and her chickens, expanded both, and took over the accounts for the well-digging work because she was better at figures than anyone else in the arrangement, and she did not see the point of false modesty about it. The combination of income meant that by the second year they were solvent in a way that was not flush but was genuinely comfortable, the kind of comfort that comes from 2 people working in the same direction. The Harcourt place they rented to a young couple named Delgado who had come up from the south with a new baby and a great deal of determination, and Josephine found that she liked having neighbors who were good people, which the Delgados were. That spring, Josephine found herself going to the Post Oaks one morning with a feeling of considerable wonder, and sitting on the bank of the creek, and thinking about the specific and strange circularity of her life, that she had found her second love the way she had found her mother's garden, by walking the ground she already knew, and finding that something new had taken root without her planning it. She came home and found Dexter at the kitchen table with the surveying manual and the account books and a cup of his own coffee, which had improved considerably since she had taken over the morning coffee production, but which he still sometimes made for himself in a slightly punishing style. "Dexter," she said. He looked up. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the morning behind her and the garden visible through the window and the house around her full of the particular aliveness of a place that is properly inhabited by people who care for it. "We're going to need the spare room," she said. He looked at her. She watched it move across his face, the information arriving, and then the slow opening of it like sunrise. He stood up so fast he knocked the surveying manual off the table. "Josephine," he said. "Sometime in November," she said, "is my best estimate." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands and looked at her the way he had on the hilltop, with the complete and whole attention of someone for whom the person in front of them is the most important thing in the landscape. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you happy?" "I am enormously well," she said. "And yes, I am very happy." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood in the kitchen in the morning light, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidness of him, and the particular quality of joy that belongs specifically to the moment before a life changes in the way it is about to change. "November," he said. "Approximately." "I'm going to need to build a crib," he said. "You are," she said. "Marcus Hale knows woodworking." "He does," she said. "You should tell him soon so he has time." "I should tell him," Dexter said, and he was still holding her face, looking at her. "In a minute. Let me just." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. "Let me just have this for 1 minute first." She put her hands over his and stayed gladly. The autumn that year was long and warm and gold, the hill country showing itself at its best, the sumac going red along the creek banks, and the post oaks holding their leaves until late. Josephine moved through the pregnancy with the practical calm of a woman who does not give trouble more authority than it deserves, though there were mornings of considerable difficulty and evenings of less considerable difficulty, and one particular afternoon when the combination of harvest work and the baby's opinions about her posture made her sit down in the garden and stay there for a while. Dexter was, she discovered, exactly the kind of man she had suspected he would be. He was not fussy. He was not overcautious. He did not treat her as though she had become fragile, which she would have found insufferable. He paid attention. He moved around her in the particular way of someone who is very aware of another person's condition, without making that awareness into a production. He came home earlier in the evenings. He took on the heavier work without being asked, and without making it into a statement about who was doing the heavy work. He built the crib with Marcus's help in 2 Saturdays in September out of good cedar, with a carved mockingbird on the headboard that he had done himself, a companion piece to the one sitting on the windowsill. When she saw the mockingbird on the crib, she stood at the nursery doorway for a full 30 seconds without speaking. "Too much," he said. "No," she said. "No, it's perfect." She looked at him across the small room. "You know what that means to me. You talked about the mockingbird for 10 minutes the third morning I knew you," he said. "You said they were the signature bird of the whole country and that you had listened to one for 30 years and it had never once repeated itself. I thought about that for a week." She walked across the room and kissed him on the jaw, which was the most available part of him at the angle she was working with, and he put his arm around her and they stood in the small cedar-smelling room and looked at the crib. "If it's a girl," she said, "I want to call her Ellen for my mother. And if it's a boy," he said. She thought about it. "You choose," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel," he said, "if that's all right." "Nathaniel is a beautiful name," she said, and felt the weight of the gift of it, the trust that went into naming a child after the person you loved most and lost. Their son was born on a cold night in the 3rd week of November with Bess Hale in attendance and Dexter in the hall outside, doing what men did in halls in that period, which was pace and be useless and feel the full weight of their helplessness in the face of the fundamental processes of life. When Bess opened the door and said, "Mr. Keating, come see your son," he went in with the look on his face of a man crossing the threshold of the most important room he has ever entered. Josephine was tired in the way that went into the bones, but she was also entirely herself, entirely present, looking at the small, red, angry creature in her arms with an expression of wonder and absolute recognition. "Nathaniel Robert Keating," she said, when Dexter came to the bedside. She had decided on the middle name sometime in the middle of the night, and it felt exactly right. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and she watched the whole sequence of it move across his face, the enormity of it, the reality of a life that had come from theirs, and she saw his eyes go bright and saw him not look away from it. "Hello, Nathaniel," he said. His voice was not steady. It was one of the very few times she had heard it not steady. "I'm glad you're here." Nathaniel Robert Keating, who had strong opinions about everything from his first hour of existence, moved his small face toward his father's voice with the instinct of the new. Bess Hale, from across the room, made a very small noise and looked at the ceiling. Nathaniel was 10 months old when the spring came in warm and early, and the garden went in earlier than usual, and the mockingbird returned to the post oaks with its entire accumulated repertoire. He sat in the shade of the porch on a blanket and watched the world with brown eyes that were exactly his father's, set in a face that was all his mother's, and expressed opinions about everything that passed through his field of vision, with the freedom of a person who had not yet learned that the world didn't require his commentary. Dexter, coming home in the early evening from a site south of town where they had hit water at 14 feet that morning, came through the gate and stopped when he saw them. Josephine on the step tying a bean vine to its pole, Nathaniel on his blanket with a wooden spool in both hands looking up at the enormous sky with the particular calm of a small human who has decided the universe is worth investigating. Dexter stood at the gate for a moment and looked at his family, which was a thing he had not had and had not been certain he deserved, and which was here, fully real in the late gold light of a Texas spring evening. "Good day," Josephine called without turning around because she knew the sound of his gait. "Hit water at 14, he said. "Pio says there's a second stratum below it that we might follow to the next claim east." "Marcus wrote the numbers down." "Marcus writes everything down," said Dexter. "You trained him." She turned and smiled at him over her shoulder, the specific smile that was for him, the one he had been collecting since September of 1883, and that had not yet stopped being the best part of any given day. Nathaniel said something urgent about the sky. Dexter came up the path and crouched down next to his son and said, "I agree completely. What else have you got?" Nathaniel offered him the spool. "Thank you," said Dexter, accepting it solemnly. Josephine watched her husband talking to their son in the evening light and felt something so full and warm in her chest that it was almost painful, the particular tenderness of abundance, of having more than you feared and exactly what you needed. The years that came after were what years are when they are good, a series of ordinary days in which the ordinary reveals itself, upon examination, to be quietly extraordinary. The well-digging operation became Keating and Garza by 1886, when Pio's expertise deserved the formal acknowledgement, and it served the growing county through the dry years and the wet years and the periods between. Marcus Hale, by the time he was 20, was the best water finder in the hill country, a gift that seemed to be partly geological knowledge and partly intuition, and Dexter treated him as the craftsman he was, and never once claimed the credit for Marcus's particular talent. The Chandler house became the Keating house in all but name, the garden expanding east in the second year and south in the third, Josephine's tomatoes becoming known enough to sell at the county fair 2 years running. She also began, at Bess Hale's suggestion, teaching reading to the children of 2 families in the New Mexican community south of town, who did not have access to the county school, a twice-weekly arrangement that began in her kitchen with a primer and a cup of chocolate for each child and gradually became something more formal and more consequential. By 1887, there were 12 children coming, and the matter of the county school's failure to include them had become a quiet crusade that Josephine pursued with the particular calm and determination she brought to all her crusades, which was to say without drama, but without any intention of stopping. Dexter, asked his opinion on the matter by Reverend Prout, who was trying to navigate the community politics of it, said that his wife was the most sensible person he knew, and that if she thought the county's children deserved equal schooling, then he was in agreement without reservation, and if Reverend Prout wanted to know more about the specifics he should ask her directly, because she would tell him plainly and accurately in about half the time it would take anyone else. The Reverend did ask her. They made progress slowly, which was the only way progress was made. Nathaniel was 3.5 and loudly opinionated about everything when Josephine told Dexter they were expecting again. This time she told him over supper, which was more dignified than the kitchen doorway occasion, and he received the news with the same quality of attention he gave all the important things, quietly and completely and with his full face. "Are you well?" he asked, the first question always. "Very well," she said. "Better than last time in the first months. Bess says that can mean a girl." Bess also predicted last time's weather from the way the catfish were jumping in the creek, he said. Bess was right about the weather, Josephine pointed out. He smiled, the full smile. She was. The daughter came in April 1887, on a bright cold morning when the redbuds were blooming along the creek and the world had the particular sharpness of early spring. She came with less complication than Nathaniel had, quickly and purposefully, as though she had considered the matter and decided to be efficient about it. Josephine held her in the redbud light of the bedroom window and said, "Ellen." Dexter, beside her, said, Ellen Josephine Keating, if you'd like." She looked at him over the baby's head with eyes that were bright again in that particular way. "I'd like," she said. Ellen Josephine Keating grew up to have her father's directness and her mother's precise attention to things, which was a powerful combination. Nathaniel, who had initially regarded his sister's arrival with diplomatic neutrality, discovered within her first 3 months that she was an audience of one for his various investigations and opinions, and adjusted his assessment of her accordingly. They grew up on a property that was full of people coming and going, well-diggers and neighbors and the reading students and Marcus Hale who stayed for supper most Fridays, and eventually married a woman named Rosa, who was one of Josephine's reading students, and who was, as Josephine told Bess with great satisfaction, one of the finest people she had ever met. They grew up knowing what their parents were to each other. Not from any performance of it, because Josephine and Dexter were not the kind of people who performed, but from the simple evidence of it, the particular quality of attention, the way their father always knew what their mother was about to say and said the other half of it. The way their mother kept the carved mockingbird on the windowsill for 20 years and replaced the cord on the old cavalry canteen when it wore out and hung it on the hook by the door where it had lived since before either of them was born. "What is that canteen for?" Ellen asked once, at perhaps 7 years old. "It's the one I used to bring your father water," Josephine said, "before you were married." "Before we had even spoken," Josephine said. Ellen looked at the canteen and then at her mother with the focused expression that meant she was processing a significant piece of information. "How long?" she asked. 6 weeks, said Josephine. "Why that long before you talked?" "Your father," said Josephine, "needed a little time to work up to it." Dexter, who had come in from the yard in time to hear this, said from the doorway, "Your mother was the one walking away every morning before I could open the door." "I was being appropriate," Josephine said. "You were terrifying," he said pleasantly. "You were terrified," she said. "There is a difference." Ellen looked between her parents during this exchange with the expression of a child watching a well-rehearsed and deeply contented argument, and felt, without having the words for it yet, the particular warmth of a home where two people have chosen each other fully and keep on choosing. The autumn of 1889 brought a dry stretch that tested the whole county, the creek dropping lower than it had in a decade, and the water table showing the strain. Keating and Garza were busier than they had ever been, and Dexter was out 6 days a week through September and October, coming home in the evenings tired in the bone-deep way of hard physical work sustained over time. Josephine watched him across the table at supper, across the lamplight, and saw the tiredness and saw, under the tiredness, something that was not unhappy. The tiredness of a man doing work that matters is a different kind than the tiredness of a man doing work that doesn't, and she knew the difference. On a Friday evening in late October, the children asleep and the house quiet with the particular deep quiet of a clear fall night, Josephine and Dexter sat on the porch in the cold that was coming on properly now, with a blanket over her legs and a cup of coffee in each of their hands, the same porch where they had sat 6 years ago on a summer evening watching bats and talking about what to do with an emptied life. "Are you happy?" she asked him. The question she had always asked him, and that had become, between them, the question that meant something beyond its literal self, meaning, "Are you here? Are you present? Is this life the life you want?" He looked at the dark hills and the stars over them and the creek glinting in the starlight below the property, and then he looked at her, this woman who had left water on his step for 6 weeks before he had found the courage to open the door, who had given him back his belief in the ordinary extraordinary possibility of things, who had made a home and a family and a life with him out of the hard ground of 2 separate griefs. "Yes," he said. "Josephine, yes. More than I knew was possible when I got here." She moved closer to him on the bench and he put his arm around her and she leaned into the warmth of him, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the mockingbird in the post oaks downstream was calling in the dark, which they both knew was unusual because mockingbirds generally went quiet in the deep dark. Night singing, she said. It does that sometimes, he said. I know. I've been listening to that bird for years. Has it ever repeated itself? She listened for a moment. The bird was moving through something new, something she didn't recognize, quick, bright notes against the silence. No, she said, never exactly the same twice. He pressed his mouth to her temple. I like that, he said. So do I, she said. They sat in the dark in the warmth of each other, and the mockingbird sang its never-repeated song over the creek, and the hill country held them in its ancient steady way, red clay and limestone and post oak, ground that had been here long before them and would be here long after, and what they had made on it and with it, and from it was real and solid and fully their own. The years continued. There were good ones and hard ones, which is the way of years, and there were dry seasons and flood seasons, and the turning of the decade into the 1890s. With all the changes, the new decade brought to a growing Texas, more people moving through, the railroad coming close enough to matter, the county growing in ways that were sometimes welcome and sometimes not. P.O. Garza's nephew came to work for Keating and Garza in 1891, and P.O.'s sister-in-law set up a small boarding house in town that became a gathering place for the Mexican families in the county. And Josephine, who had been fighting the school question quietly for years, finally saw a second classroom open at the county school in 1892, which was not the full victory she wanted but was a genuine one. And she accepted it with the practical satisfaction of someone who understands that progress happens by increments. Nathaniel grew tall like his father and had his mother's gift for paying attention, and at 14, he could read water-bearing strata in broken ground the way Marcus had at 20, which meant he had absorbed it from both of them, the surveying knowledge from his father's shelf, and the land knowledge from following his mother around a garden since he could walk. Ellen grew fierce and precise and kind in equal measure, and at 10 was already the person her parents went to when something needed to be communicated clearly, because she had an instinctive grasp of which words mattered. At Christmas of 1892, the whole family on the hill behind the house in the cold gray light, putting fresh juniper on Robert's grave the way Josephine had done every Christmas, Nathaniel asked his mother who Robert was, because he was 12 now and had always known of the grave but had never been told fully. Josephine told him plainly and completely, as she told all things. A good man who had built the house they lived in and worked the land they grew on, who had been her first husband, and was part of the story of everything that came after. A man who deserved to be remembered with respect and kindness. Nathaniel listened. He looked at the grave and then at his father, who was standing a little back the way he always did at the grave, hat in hand. "Do you mind?" Nathaniel asked his father with the directness of his mother and the seriousness of his father. Dexter looked at his son. "No," he said. "Robert Chandler was a good man who loved your mother and left her with a piece of ground that she made into something. I'm grateful to him." He paused. "We don't forget the people who came before us. We carry them with us." Nathaniel thought about that. Ellen, at 5, was pulling at Josephine's sleeve about something that had nothing to do with any of this, and Josephine attended to her without losing the thread of the moment, which was a skill she had always had. Dexter caught Josephine's eye over Ellen's head, and she saw the steady warmth of him, unchanged from the morning she had first seen his face, and she thought that the years had done to both of them what they do to good things, made them more themselves, more solid, more fully what they had been becoming since that first gray morning when she had walked 300 yards in the dark to leave water on a stranger's doorstep, and told herself it was nothing more than simple Christian charity. It had not been nothing. It had been everything. It had been the first step of the rest of her life, taken in the dark before the sun was up, carrying water for a man she didn't know because the evidence of small things had told her he was worth the trouble. She had been right. She had been right about all of it. The spring of 1893 was wet and long, and the creek ran high and green through the post oaks, and the garden went in extravagant, and the mockingbird came back to its cottonwood, and began again the endless, unrepeated song of its seasons. Nathaniel was 13 and already taller than his mother. Ellen was 6 and in her first full year of school and had opinions about every subject offered. Josephine was 39 years old and felt it not as age but as fullness, the fullness of a life thoroughly lived, of a person who has done what she set out to do and more than she thought was possible. Dexter was 43 and wore his years the way good timber wears weather, not despite them but with them, the grain of the wood showing better for the years of wind and sun. He still had the directness, still the quality of stillness in thinking, still the low voice that was rarely raised and when raised meant something. He still looked at her across rooms the way he had that first morning on his doorstep, with the full particular attention of someone for whom she was the most important thing in the landscape. On the last evening of April, they walked the property line together in the long spring light, the way they had done 100 times, the grass coming in lush from the wet spring, the redbuds still faintly pink, the mockingbird audible from the creek below. "The Delgados want to buy the Harcourt place," Dexter said. "I know," said Josephine. "Maria told me. Are you all right with selling?" She thought about it honestly. The Harcourt place had been the beginning of everything, the house he had moved into, the doorstep she had walked to every morning in the dark for 6 weeks. It had been rented these 12 years and well used, and the Delgados had built a life in it, the same way she and Dexter had built their life here. "Yes," she said, "it should be theirs. It's been theirs in spirit for a long time." He nodded. "I'll talk to Delgado tomorrow." They walked a little further. The sun was going down behind the western hills in the particular layered way of a spring sunset, orange and rose and a deep, impossible blue. "Dexter," she said. "Yes. Do you remember what you said? The evening you told me you couldn't picture the next year without me in it." "I remember," he said. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "About how close it came to not happening. You nearly didn't open the door for weeks. I nearly stopped going. Any particular morning either of us could have moved differently and it all would have been different." "But we didn't," he said. "But we didn't," she agreed. He took her hand as they walked, the way he had on 100 walks, warm and unhurried, and they went along the fence line in the last gold light with the hill country around them, and the mockingbird calling downstream and the house behind them full of their children and their life. "I'm glad you kept going," he said. "I'm glad you finally opened the door," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Josephine Keating, Dexter Keating, what do you want for the next year?" She looked at the hills going pink in the sunset and felt the spring warmth and the solid warmth of his hand and the particular deep satisfaction of a life that has resolved itself into what it was always trying to become. "This," she said. "Exactly this. As many years of this as we can have." "Then that's what we'll do," he said. And they walked on together in the good spring evening, in the hill country of Texas in the year 1893, two people who had found each other in the most ordinary of ways, a canteen left on a doorstep, a note tied with twine, a cup of terrible coffee in a spare kitchen, and had made from those small ordinary things a life so full and warm and real that it would hold them, and their children, and the memory of everyone they had loved and lost, for all the years that followed. The mockingbird sang on. The creek ran on. The post oaks held their leaves in the last of the light, and the long Texas evening came down easy and gold over everything, over the Keating house with its good garden and its cedar crib and its old cavalry canteen hanging on the hook by the door, over the new Delgado house at the end of Juniper Lane, over the spring on the north bank of the creek that ran cold and clear all year, over the hill with the post oak tree and the 2 graves, and the view that went for 20 miles in 3 directions. Over all of it the same sky, the enormous permanent Texas sky, turning from gold to rose to the deep certain blue of evening, and below it 2 people walking home.